Piye, also recorded as Pianki, was both a devout priest of Amun and a formidable strategist. Around 747 BCE he began to extend his authority northward, carefully watching the disunity of Egypt's many petty rulers. To Piye, the task was not simple conquest but sacred duty. He believed the god Amun had chosen him to restore Ma'at, the divine order, to the entire Nile Valley. He led an army of disciplined Nubian soldiers, cavalrymen hardened by desert training, and priests who carried the standards of Amun before them. Their advance was steady and deliberate, a fusion of spiritual mission and military precision. The Egypt he entered was a patchwork of rival principalities. In the fertile delta, Libyan-descended princes held sway, while Upper Egypt was divided among warlords and local dynasts. Memphis, once the beating heart of Egyptian kingship, had lost its authority. Piye's arrival was at first greeted with a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. He did not simply storm cities, he offered terms, calling on local rulers to submit to the one true king ordained by Amun. Many did so willingly, swearing allegiance and sending tribute south to Napata. Yet resistance lingered in the north. Tefnakt, a powerful prince of Sais in the western delta, rallied a coalition of forces to challenge the Nubian advance. Piye responded with a campaign that would become legendary. Crossing the Nile in a flotilla of warships, he moved from victory to victory. At each city he performed elaborate rites to Amun, purifying himself and offering sacrifice before striking militarily. His soldiers were fierce but disciplined, capturing key strongholds while sparing those who submitted. Eventually he laid siege to Memphis, the ancient capital. After intense fighting, the city surrendered, and Piye entered as a liberator rather than a destroyer, proclaiming that Egypt was once more united under a single divine king. Having achieved what he saw as his holy mission, Piye did something remarkable. Instead of remaining in the north, he returned to Napata, leaving trusted governors to oversee Egypt. This decision reflected both pragmatism and devotion. Napata, with its sacred mountain and powerful priesthood, remained the spiritual heart of his rule. From there Piye issued edicts and maintained authority, his victory stela carved in stone to record the unification of the two lands under a Nubian pharaoh. Piye's reign demonstrated that Nubia was not a mere peripheral culture but a power capable of shaping the destiny of the entire Nile Valley. His success also set the pattern for those who followed: devotion to Amun, respect for Egyptian traditions, and the blending of Nubian vigor with the ancient symbols of pharaonic rule. Upon his death, he was buried in a pyramid at El Karu, a royal cemetery in Nubia, surrounded by horses that had served him in life, their presence a testament to his love of fine steeds and to the central role cavalry played in his campaigns. After Piye, his brother Shabaka ascended the throne, determined not only to preserve the empire but to deepen the fusion of Egyptian and Nubian ideals. Shabaka is remembered as a consolidator and a restorer. He moved the royal residence to Memphis, reasserting Egypt's northern capital as a seat of power, yet he maintained the sanctity of Napata. One of his most famous acts was commissioning the so-called Shabaka stone, a text that preserved ancient theological writings and mythological traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Through Shabaka's policies, the 25th dynasty became known as a period of cultural renaissance, where temple building, religious ceremonies, and classical art flourished. Shabaka also strengthened ties with priestly institutions, ensuring that the high clergy of Amun recognized Nubian authority. His building projects stretched from Thebes to the Delta. Temples were refurbished, statues erected, and rituals revived. The Kushite pharaohs saw themselves as guardians of a sacred inheritance, determined to revive the spiritual grandeur of earlier Egyptian dynasties. Under Shabaka, Egypt experienced a sense of order and piety not seen for generations. Following Shabaka came Shabitku, who maintained the dynasty's grip while confronting growing challenges from the Near East. The mighty Assyrian Empire was expanding westward, threatening Egypt's traditional influence in the Levant. generations. Following Shabaka came Shabitku, who maintained the dynasty's grip while confronting growing challenges from the Near East. The mighty Assyrian Empire was expanding westward, threatening Egypt's traditional influence in the Levant. Shabitku worked to fortify the northern borders and maintain alliances. He upheld the religious fervor of his predecessors, continuing to support the great temples and the priesthood of Amun. Though less celebrated than Pir or Taharqa, Shabitku played a critical role in stabilizing the realm and preparing it for the remarkable reign of the next great Kushite king. That king was Taharqa, perhaps the most famous of all the Black Pharaohs. Rising to power around 690 BCE, Taharqa combined the military prowess of his forebears with an extraordinary vision for monumental architecture. He embarked on ambitious building projects throughout Egypt and Nubia. Massive columns and soaring pylons bearing his cartouche still stand at Karnak, evidence of a ruler who sought to leave a permanent mark on the landscape. He expanded the great temple of Amun, sponsored shrines across the land, and commissioned works that blended Egyptian artistry with Nubian vitality. Taharqa's reign was also defined by dramatic military encounters. The Assyrians, under kings Esarhaddon and later Ashurbanipal, launched powerful campaigns into the Levant and toward Egypt. Taharqa at first achieved stunning victories, pushing back Assyrian forces and inspiring admiration even among his enemies. Biblical accounts may reference him as the Tiraka king of Kush, who marched to aid Jerusalem against the Assyrians. But the struggle was relentless. Eventually the Assyrians regrouped and invaded Egypt itself. After fierce battles, they captured Memphis and forced Taharqa to retreat southward. Yet his resilience was legendary. He returned more than once to challenge their domination, embodying the fierce independence of the Kushite spirit. Despite these trials, Taharqa never abandoned his commitment to religious devotion and architectural grandeur. He built extensively at Napata and across Nubia, reinforcing the idea that the Kushite heartland remained the spiritual wellspring of the dynasty. His pyramids at Nuri, some of the largest in Nubian history, testify to his ambition and faith. Even as foreign powers pressed on Egypt's borders, Taharqa's reign shone as a high point of art, culture, and resistance. As the decades passed, the pressure from Assyria became overwhelming. After Taharqa's death, his successor Tantamani inherited both the throne and the struggle. He mounted a bold attempt to reclaim Egypt from Assyrian control, briefly retaking Thebes and Memphis. But the might of the Assyrian military machine proved too great. After a series of brutal campaigns, the Assyrians sacked Thebes, looting its temples and carrying off treasures. Tantamani retreated to Nubia, marking the end of effective Kushite rule over Egypt. Yet even in defeat, the kings of Napata maintained their independence, continuing to reign over a strong and vibrant kingdom south of the First Cataract. The withdrawal from Egypt did not mean the end of Kushite civilization. Far from it. The dynasty that had once ruled the two lands turned its energy inward, strengthening the Nubian heartland. The royal cemeteries at Nuri and later at Meroe grew as new centers of power and artistry. Kushite culture evolved, blending Egyptian traditions with indigenous innovations. Ironworking flourished, trade routes stretched into Central Africa and the Red Sea, and the famous Candate queens would in later centuries command armies and negotiate with Rome itself. The legacy of Pir, Shabaka, Taharqa, and their line endured as a beacon of African sovereignty and creativity. The memory of the 25th dynasty carried profound significance. For centuries later, Egyptians and Nubians alike look back to these black pharaohs as restorers of the old order, champions of Amun, and defenders of the Nile Valley against foreign domination. Their pyramids still stand in the sands of Sudan, steeper and more numerous than those at Giza, silent witnesses to a time when power flowed from the south to the north and back again. Modern excavations continue to uncover temples, inscriptions, and artifacts that reveal the richness of their world, challenging outdated notions of where civilization's center lay. Even today, The story of the Nubian and Kushite pharaohs resonates as a testament to Africa's central role in world history. It reminds us that the great river carried ideas and empires in both directions, and that cultural exchange and resilience can produce remarkable achievements. The Black Kings and Queens of Kush did more than rule Egypt, they revitalized its spirit and left a legacy that endures in stone and memory.
The Kingdom of Dahomey, home of warriors, kings and legends. To understand King Bahanzin, where trade flowed across deserts and seas, where the West African coast was known not for slavery, but for gold, art and military power. West Africa 1700s before European domination. Dahomey was not born weak. It was forged in war, built through strategy, and ruled by kings who feared no empire. In the 1600s, 3 brothers fought for the right to rule. One of them, Dakodonu, founded the dynasty that would one day produce Bahanzin, the last independent king of Dahomey. Dahomey became feared not just for its kings, but for its army, an army unlike any in the world, because half of it was made of women. While Dahomey grew in strength, Europe watched. This was the 1800s, the age of empire. Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, carving Africa like a feast. The world was changing, and Dahomey was standing in the way. By the mid-1800s, Dahomey controlled one of the most valuable coastlines in West Africa, Oudka region the Europeans named the slave. But what they did not understand was that Dahomey would rather burn than kneel. Before the ships came, before the flags were planted in African soil, there were kingdoms, empires, civilizations older than London, Paris and Berlin, and among them stood a kingdom feared, respected, and undefeated for centuries. We must first understand the world that existed before him. A world where African kings signed treaties as equals. Coast. But to Dahomey, it was not a weakness, it was power. Foreign ships could not dock without Dahomey's permission. No trade passed without tribute. And every rival state feared the sound of Dahomey's war drums rolling from the forest. But deep inside the royal palace, a prophecy was already whispered. A day will come when the white strangers will demand the throne. If the king resists, the world will burn. A child was born who would prove that prophecy true. He grew up not with books, not with tutors, not with fear. They said he could command an army before he could grow a beard. That even the royal pythons bowed when he entered the shrine. The world had changed. They wanted Dahomey next. But for palm oil, trade routes, and total domination, then missionaries. History did not begin with Europe before the treaties. A priest spoke to the king. If the king bows, the kingdom will die. And years later, his name was Kondo, the child who would become King Bahanzin. But with war drums, but with warriors, but with prophecy, that he could memorize every drum language in the kingdom. By the time Bahanzin reached adulthood, the French had already taken Senegal, not just for land. They sent diplomats first, then missionaries, then soldiers.
But what they did not understand was that Dahomey would rather burn than kneel. The French believed they were marching to collect a colony, but what they found was a king who would rather destroy the land beneath his feet than surrender it. The War of the Atlantic had begun, and Bahanzin was ready. When King Glil died, the palace drums fell silent. The elders gathered, the people waited, and the prophecy finally returned. The one who rises now will decide the fate of Dahomey. And so, Prince Kondo stepped forward. The priest bows. The Amazons kneel. He did not take the throne as a servant of peace, but as a storm. He became Bahanzin, the mighty shark, a king who rules the sea and devours his enemies. The French governor sent a letter to the new king, a letter that demanded obedience, compliance, tribute. Send your sons to be educated in France. Open your ports to our ships. Lower your flag beneath ours. Bahanzin replied, the land under my feet is not for sale. The air above my people is not for rent. Dahomey kneels to no one. Before the French even landed, Bahanzin called for the elite. The Ahosi, the Amazons of Dahomey. Scene shifts, female warriors sharpening swords, chanting in formation, training barefoot in red earth. They fought like lions. They marched like thunder. They feared no man, because they had killed many. Europe wrote about them in disbelief. Women who fight, like demons. But they were not demons. They were protectors. The French finally sent soldiers, confident, laughing, sure of victory. They had rifles. Dahomey had courage. The world expected a massacre, but history remembers the day the invaders ran. France did not report it as a defeat. They called it a tactical delay. But the truth is simple. Dahomey won the first battle. France was shocked. Europe was silent. And Behanzin stood undefeated. But the war was not over. It was only beginning. In Paris, the newspapers refused to believe the reports. Beaten by savages? Europe humiliated in Africa? So France did what empires do when their pride is injured. They came back with bigger guns. They did not come to negotiate. They came to erase Dahomey from the map. The messengers brought word. The ocean was full of ships. The air smelled of smoke and iron. One advisor begged him to surrender. Another suggested retreat. But the king rose and spoke only one sentence. If we lose the land, we lose nothing. If we lose our honor, we lose everything. The French opened fire from the sea. Villages burned. The sky turned black. But from the forest came the answer, the Amazons. Barefoot, unbending, singing their death song. Some were shot. Some were captured. None were broken. A French officer wrote, "They fought like lions. I hope never to meet them again." The French surrounded the capital. They offered Behanzin a deal, exile in exchange for surrender. "I will not sign away the soul of my people." He broke his royal seal so no treaty could carry his name. And he walked into exile, undefeated in spirit. Without its king, Dahomey did not fall. It changed. The French raised their own flag. They built forts. They rewrote the laws. But they could not command loyalty, only obedience. In homes, in shrines, in songs, the people still whispered one name, Behanzin. France could rebuild buildings. France could seize land. But France could not erase a legend. They outlawed his anthem. They banned his symbol, the shark. They even tried to forbid children from saying his name. Because a dead king can still command an army, if he lives in the mind. When the elders gathered at night, a drumbeat returned. Children learned it in whispers. Warriors taught it in footsteps. We are the people of fire. We are the children of the shark. We bow to no ocean but our own. This was how Africa kept its heroes alive, not in statues, but in sound. Almost 100 years later, the world forgot. But Benin did not. Across the country, the old songs became national anthems. The shark became a symbol of strength. And Behanzin was declared, not defeated, but exiled warrior king of the nation. A king can lose his throne, but not his place in history. He was not just a king. He was a question asked by every African empire that refused to kneel. What is a conqueror? If the conquered refuses to be conquered, his kingdom fell. His people survived. His name returned. And today, across Africa and the world, the story of Behanzin burns again, not as tragedy, but as proof. You can defeat a nation's army, but you cannot defeat its memory. They tried to erase the past. We're bringing it back. Subscribe to African Untold Histories.
History did not forget this African empire. It erased it. Not because it never existed, but because its existence destroyed the lie the world needed Africa to be. Before borders, before colonization, before Africa was reduced to footnotes and stereotypes, there was power here. Organized power, spiritual power. A system so complete that history itself chose silence. This is the story they never wanted to survive. History did not forget this African empire. It erased it. Not because it never existed, But because its existence destroyed the lie, the world needed Africa to be. Before borders. Before colonization. Before Africa was reduced to footnotes and stereotypes. There was power here, organized power, spiritual power, a system so complete that history itself chose silence. This is the story they never wanted to survive. Long before maps pretended Africa was empty land waiting to be discovered, the continent already knew itself. Rivers were not obstacles, they were highways. Forests were not wild, they were guarded. Land was not owned, it was protected. At the center of this world existed an empire with no official name recorded in modern books. Not because it lacked identity, but because its identity was never meant to be written down. Knowledge was sacred, and sacred things were not given to paper. This empire had laws but no prisons. It had leaders but no tyrants. It had wealth but no hunger. Order was enforced not through fear, but through belonging. From childhood, every person knew their role, their responsibility, their connection to the whole. Disobedience was rare because shame was stronger than punishment. This was governance without violence, and that terrified outsiders. Their settlements were not random. Homes, roads, meeting grounds, all aligned with celestial movements. Solstices, star paths,
lunar cycles. The sky was not decoration. It was instruction. Elders taught that what happens above must be balanced below.
So the empire was built as a mirror of the universe itself. This knowledge did not come from guesswork. It came from centuries of observation passed orally, protected fiercely. Power in this empire was not loud. There were no golden thrones, no crowns dripping with jewels, no public displays of dominance. True authority belonged to councils of elders, priestesses, and masked figures whose identities were known only within sacred circles. The ruler was never the most visible person. Visibility was considered dangerous. Those who desired attention were disqualified from leadership. When foreign explorers finally reached remnants of this civilization, they were confused. They expected chaos. They found infrastructure. They expected primitive life. They found mathematics and architecture. They expected superstition. They found medicine. But instead of acknowledging African genius, they wrote something else. They wrote unknown builders, lost people, prehistoric mystery. Anything except African. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting this. Africa did not need saving. Africa did not need instruction. Africa did not need rulers. Africa already had them. And that truth was dangerous. So silence became policy. Deep within the forests, carved stones existed, not words, but symbols. To outsiders, they meant nothing. To initiates, they carried a warning. When strangers begin to record us, we must disappear. This was not fear. It was foresight. This empire did not fall. It prepared, because it knew something history did not want to admit. The greatest power is not domination. It is survival.
The empire was not erased because it was weak. It was erased because it knew too much. Knowledge is harmless until it challenges authority. And this knowledge did exactly that. Healers in this empire performed procedures outsiders would later call impossible. Bone setting. Herbal anesthesia. Surgical techniques learned through generations of experimentation. Illness was treated holistically, body, mind, spirit. This was not magic. It was science without arrogance. They mapped stars using naked eyes and memory. They predicted eclipses, tracked seasons, planned agriculture according to cosmic rhythms. Centuries later, Europe would discover what Africa already practiced. But credit never returned home. More dangerous than medicine, more threatening than astronomy, was governance. This empire proves something colonial systems could not allow to be true, that Africans could rule themselves efficiently. No kings by divine decree. No tyranny justified by bloodline. Leadership was temporary. Power was accountable. That idea alone was revolutionary. When outsiders realized they could not dominate this empire directly, they chose another method. Control the story. Rename the achievements. Scatter the people. Discredit oral history. Erase memory. The elders gathered. They did not argue. They did not panic. They agreed, comma. The empire would end on its own terms. Cities were abandoned intentionally. Knowledge was divided into rituals. Power was hidden in culture. Drums became records. Songs became archives. Traditions became vaults. The empire vanished, but the people survived. Before dispersing, one rule was spoken. When the world is ready to hear us, our stories will return. This was not hope, comma. It was certainty. They did not lose history. They hid it.
History is cracking. Not because institutions changed, but because memory did. If Africa had no history, why was so much effort spent erasing it? If Africa had no systems, why were its structures studied, copied, and renamed? Truth does not need protection. Lies do. This is not about the past. It is about identity. A people who know who they were. Cannot be convinced they are nothing. Across Africa and the diaspora, stories are resurfacing. Oral traditions once mocked are being recorded. Artifacts once ignored are being re-examined. History is being forced to listen. By hearing this story, you become part of its survival. Empires die. Stories don't. History didn't forget Africa. It was afraid of it, and fear always leaves evidence. If this video disappears one day, remember, you heard it here first. Because this is not just African history. It is a story that was buried, rewritten, and almost erased forever. Tonight, you will hear the truth about an African power so feared. History itself tried to kill it.
They told you Africa had no history.
No queens. No advanced kingdoms. They said Africa waited for the world to arrive.
But that story was designed, not discovered. Because long before Europe learned how to rule itself,
Africa had already mastered power, spirituality, warfare, and knowledge. And some of that knowledge was considered too dangerous to survive. This is one of those stories, a story whispered in Benin forests, hidden in Dahomey traditions, and avoided by colonial historians. They called her many names, the Serpent Queen, before Dahomey became a feared kingdom. The land was wild alive, but the one that survived. Forests breathed. Rivers curved like living beings. And serpents were not feared. They were respected. Among the Fawn people, the serpent was not evil. It was Danaido Huedo, the cosmic serpent believed to hold the world together. The elders said, if Dan ever releases the earth, everything ends. This belief shaped Dahomey power. And then, a child was born. The night she was born, storms split the sky. Thunder rolled without rain. Animals fled the forest. And midwives froze in fear. Because wrapped around the newborn's wrist was a living serpent. It did not bite. It did not flee. It simply watched. The elders said only one thing. She does not belong to us alone. The child was named Dikapo, the one who walks between worlds. As she grew, strange things followed her. Snakes gathered where she slept. Poison never harmed her. And when she spoke to animals, they listened. Dahomey was under threat. Rival kingdoms attacked. Slave raiders circled. War was inevitable. When the king died, the council resisted her rule. A woman, young, silent, but on the night of her coronation, the forest moved. Thousands of serpents crossed the land, blocking roads surrounding enemy camps. By morning, invaders fled without battle. That day, Dikapo became queen. Not by force, by fear and belief.
under her rule, Dahomey changed. The Agoji, warrior women, were trained not just to fight, but to move like serpents. Silent, precise, unpredictable, enemies disappeared in the forests. not killed. Taken. Some said the queen commanded living traps. Paths that shifted, roots that moved, shadows that swallowed men. Was it magic? Or mastery of terrain and psychology? It didn't matter. Because fear works whether magic is real or not. But power always demands payment. The elders warned her. Spirits do not give forever. The queen began spending nights alone at the sacred tree, where serpents coiled endlessly around its roots. Villagers said her eyes changed. Her voice deepened. Her presence felt heavy. Calmer. Then came the final invasion. Fire. Steel. Numbers greater than any before. And the queen made her choice. On a moonless night, she vanished. So did the palace. So did the invaders. By morning, a new river flowed through the land, twisting like a serpent's body. No bodies were ever found. No records written. Colonial historians later called it a myth. But elders still whisper. She did not die. She became. Because stories like this remind the world of something dangerous. That Africa did not lack power. Africa mastered it. That African women ruled with authority. African spirituality shaped empires. And African knowledge terrified outsiders. That truth threatened the narrative. So it was buried. Until now. If you felt something while listening, it's because stories remember us, even when history lies. And these are the stories they tried to erase.
Before Europe wrote history, Africa made a decision not to conquer, not to beg, but to disappear without dying. What you are about to hear was never meant to survive. Long before modern maps, there existed an African empire built on knowledge, not war. They did not expand with swords. They expanded with understanding. Their kings studied the stars. Their priests measured time. Their farmers understood the land. They knew when rains would fall. They knew when rivers would change. They knew when danger was coming. Time was not something they feared. Time was something they controlled. This empire believed one truth above all. If you control time, You control memory. Foreign traders arrived. They saw cities without walls, roads without guards, and people who did not panic. What they saw confused them. What they felt frightened them. Because nothing here fit the story they believed about the world. This empire had a secret. Knowledge can protect more than weapons. And when questions became dangerous, the elders gathered, not to fight, but to plan survival. They chose silence over slaughter. They chose scattering over extinction. Libraries were burned by their own hands, not in chaos, but in ritual. Cities were emptied slowly. Names were changed. Stories were hidden in songs. And when the outsiders returned, they found ruins. They assumed collapse. They never imagined. This was strategy. This was not the end. This was preparation. History says Africa was discovered. The truth is more uncomfortable. Africa chose. Who would never understand it? When explorers returned generations later, they found broken stone. And overgrown paths. They wrote what they could see. They ignored what they could not explain. Oral history confused them. Symbols frustrated them. Silence angered them. So they replaced silence with assumption. Maps were redrawn. Empires were minimized. Genius was dismissed as coincidence. The greatest lie was not spoken loudly. It was repeated quietly. Africa had no history. Africa had no science. Africa had no empires. And eventually, the world accepted it. But African memory did not vanish. It adapted. Knowledge became proverbs. Architecture became pattern. Astronomy became ritual. . Drums carried information. Hair carried maps. Stories carried warnings. Colonizers wrote books. Africans preserved memory. One was louder. The other was stronger. Generations passed. And the lie grew older. Then the truth. Until something changed. People began to notice patterns. Alignments. Mathematics hidden in art. Ruins that should not exist. Where history said nothing lived. The lie began to crack.
What they could not destroy. They taught the world to forget. But forgetting is not erasure. It is delay. Today, memory is returning. Quietly. Carefully. Through questions. Why do African calendars align with stars? Why do ancient sites match solstices? Why do stories repeat across regions? Because the empire never died. It waited dot comma. It hid in culture. It slept in language. It survived in ritual. And now, remembrance has begun. Not as revenge. Not as anger. But as truth. Africa does not need permission to exist in history. It only needs honesty. This story was never lost. It was protected. And if you are hearing this now, it means the silence is ending. Memory is waking. And history is no longer alone. If this history feels hidden, it's because it was.
Power attracts attention. But power that contradicts a global narrative attracts something far more dangerous. Fear. The moment outsiders understood what Africa truly represented, the relationship changed. Trade turned into observation. Observation turned into strategy. And strategy turned into control. They came not with armies at first. They came with questions. Questions about gold. Questions about roots. Questions about leadership. They studied governance quietly. They learned where authority flowed. They took notes. Because conquest is easiest when you understand what you intend to break. The first strike was not violent. It was intellectual. Stories began to shift. African achievement was reframed as coincidence. Systems were described as primitive. Knowledge was called imitation. And slowly, the image of Africa was reduced. From originator to participant, then came extraction. Gold was removed without balance. Artifacts were taken without context. Sacred objects were displayed as curiosities. Libraries were dismissed. All historians were ignored. Because written proof could be archived. Spoken truth could be denied. Conflict followed. Not always open war. Sometimes division. Sometimes proxy rulers. Sometimes carefully planted instability. Empires don't always fall from invasion. Some collapse when trust is poisoned. Cities weakened. Trade routes were disrupted. Scholars were scattered. What could not be destroyed was removed. What could not be removed was discredited. And what could not be discredited was erased entirely. When colonial control solidified, the final act began. History was rewritten. Africa was repositioned as beginning only when Europe arrived. Everything before that became prehistory. And prehistory requires no respect. This was not ignorance. It was design. Because a continent with a remembered past is harder to dominate. And a people who know who they were are dangerous to those who benefit from their silence. Yet even then, something went wrong. The erasure was incomplete. Fragments remained. Ruins refused to disappear. Oral history continued in whispers. Truth slipped through cracks. And now, centuries later, those cracks are widening because lies require constant maintenance. Truth only needs time.